Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global
Recording in progress.
Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. As you're all aware, the session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. And to access the service, kindly locate the globe icon on your screen, select a preferred language, and use the original sound. On behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, I appreciate our sponsors and partners who have continually made it possible for us to bring these sessions to you. And without wasting much time, join you. Welcome, Jim. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. How are you?
I'm doing well, Jim. I hope you are too.
Yeah, I'm very good. I'm not in my own office today, so let me know if there's any glitches on the audio or on the sharing as we go on.
Very well.
Welcome, everybody. It's good of you to join us again. And today we're going to talk about really following up on our last conversations. And we're going to talk about, as always, the market and the market outlook. And we're going to focus in particular on demand, as that seems to be a concern for many people. And then we're going to look at the new supply-demand scenario, part 2. We started this 2 weeks ago. And today we're going to have a look at some of the consequences of the changes in the supply-demand balance for African countries, West Africa in particular, and we're going to have a look at some of the potential solutions. We're also joined today by Forster Boateng, the CEO of the Tree Crops Development Authority of Ghana, a relatively new organization that's making great steps forward in developing the cashew sector and in regulating the cashew sector in Ghana. Foster, you're very welcome. We're going to hear from Foster a little bit later on, but before we do that, let's have a look at the market. And, I'm saying here, summer is a state of mind. Well, if you're from a country that has 4 seasons, you're probably aware that the summer period is a very quiet period. But I think that maybe what we're looking at the moment is that the market is in that state of mind. Not much reason to do anything. Not much change. So it's easier not to make a decision in those circumstances, and people will most likely only make those decisions when they really have to. And we'll have a look at why that might be and how it might change. Focusing in on the market news and the trends, well, we can see that still kernels prices are relatively static at the bottom of the current range, maybe just a touch, as we'd say here, a smidgen stronger, but not much more than that. Cashew kernels exports are strong from Vietnam. I think actually they're quite strong from West Africa too, but it's Vietnam that makes the difference in the big picture. Demand in India has been picking up. We have the peak buying season coming around for Diwali in November, a little bit later than normal. But this is the time of year when we see Indian demand really kick off. Meantime, raw cashew nut trading is relatively inactive. Prices are stable at relatively low levels. We're going to have a look at that in a few minutes. But RCN imports are pretty strong. So you have these two contradictory threads in the market at the moment. You have statistically imports and exports strong, but the market continues to look maybe not weak, but stable at the bottom of the range. It's a little bit of a puzzle. We've spoken about this before, but as the year goes on, it gets a little bit clearer exactly how that's happening. Let's have a look at prices. Not a great deal to say on cashew kernels prices right now. This time I put in the selection of grades. I put in 4 main grades, and I just thought we should look at the differentials. So we have generally prices unchanged for about 2.5 months, steady at the bottom of the market. The gap between the benchmark W320s and the brokens has widened a little. And this, if we looked at that for lower grade brokens, so this is LPs or LWPs and splits, fancy splits, white splits, whatever exact grade you're talking about, it might still be a factor that there is a certain amount of struggling on demand for some of these lower grades. And maybe we could conclude, if we, in particular, that the food service sector may have been more impacted by low quality and the economic conditions, especially in Europe and North America. Whatever the case, what we're looking at is that the gap is a little bit different to what it was, but it is much narrower than when we go back to December 2020, when that gap was very wide. And probably you can notice when we look at these charts that in periods of volatility or post volatility, the grades tend to concertina together. This, of course, is very difficult for people launching new products, and particularly during that period, 2016 to 2019, when a lot of new products were launched, and those businesses have found it difficult to keep going after that period. It's very difficult to launch new products and to develop new uses at times of volatility. Why is that important? Well, stay with me. We're going to talk about that when we get to this new supply-demand balance discussion. Looking at our CN prices, relatively stable for main grades. If we look at this chart, this tracks cost and freight prices unadjusted for quality for 5 main origins in West Africa since 2021. And what you can see is quite a volatile picture. You can see that right now prices have relatively stabilized. We're looking here at the more recent grades that are freshly available. So Benin is available now because it's a little bit late this year. Indian buyers are interested. Guinea-Bissau, same thing. It looks like we're coming to the end of the season, but some product still for resale. Meantime, other origins, prices have fallen, mainly because the quality falls at this time of year. And that's an important aspect as we look forward in this new supply-demand scenario. So relatively steady in countries that would be in high season now. Benin, rather not in high season, but in high trading season due to the new regulations there. And Ivory Coast, prices fallen mostly on low quality. We'll see later just how well sold these countries are. If you look at imports, and I've been saying that imports are pretty strong into Vietnam, and that's for sure. So here we're looking at monthly imports. The last 3 years, or 3 of the last 4 years. I skipped 2021 because the numbers are not reliable in 2021. And you can see that in July 2023, imports, remarkable really, the highest July ever, following the highest June ever, following the highest May ever. So in the last 3 months, statistically, we've seen quite an increase in imports. If we look at the cumulative situation, so you can see that over January to July, and that's the statistics that we have for full months, you can see that we are already in a situation where we've reached the same level as October of 2022. So now we're seeing Vinacas in Vietnam advising processors not to stockpile, their words, not mine, not to stockpile raw cashew nuts as supply is abundant. I'm not entirely sure of that, looking at the situation in West Africa. And you would have to ask the question when we look at the imports at this time of year that perhaps there was a little bit of early season overreaction in Vietnam to the fact that the Cambodian crop is a little bit lower, and to the fact that perhaps people expected that India would import to the same volumes as it did last year, which was a record over 1.3 million tons. So imports to Vietnam, very strong. Let's have a look at the origins and where those imports have come from. And this tells us quite an interesting story. So we have picked 5 major suppliers: Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Cambodia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And what you can see is that imports to Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire are up by 60% for the time of year. That doesn't mean it'll be 60% at the end of the year. Ghana, obviously Ghana includes some product that has found its way across the border from Cote d'Ivoire. Ghanaian trade, as Foster will tell us later, is really big this year. And we know some of that comes across the border from different countries, but it includes some from Cote d'Ivoire. And we can see that Nigerian trade with Vietnam this year, at this point in time, is way up, more than double where it was last year. Of course, the one that sticks out from this is Cambodia, the only one that is lower in 2023 than in 2022. So importing from the other origins is in part to make up for a shortfall of about 100,000 tons from Cambodia compared to last year. But as I said, imports are up 28%, so there's much more than that 100,000 tons involved in these imports from West African countries, as we can see. Tanzania is there because we've seen that in the early part of 2023, 2022-23 crop was imported to Vietnam, and it's slightly up on the previous year. It'll be interesting to see how that starts the new season in September. So when we look at prices, so we've talked about the volume. Now let's look at the prices. So what you can see on this line chart is the average monthly import price of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam from all origins since January 2020. So you can see it goes up and down in quite a familiar pattern when you look at it. First point is that the prices for July 2023, the last period for which we have full statistics, match the prices way back in July 2020. So prices are pretty low compared to previous years, and they are pretty low earlier in the year than in previous years. So the familiar pattern is there. Prices start quite high and fall during the season. That's to do with actual factors such as quality, demand, and of course availability, but it's also to do with other factors. So we can see that pattern in each of those 3 years. Prices starting relatively high and falling, but in each year the starting point has been lower, significantly lower this year. 2020, you'll notice, was quite a volatile pattern, but that really, I think we probably need to just step back from 2020 a little bit, given the uncertainty that was created around the COVID pandemic in the first half of the year. So we're talking about prices naturally falling in the course of the year, month by month. We're talking about that due to higher availability and lower quality. It's also due to the influence of speculation, the power of traders, their ability to start prices quite high and knock down the RCN price. Now that has impacts for countries that regulate the raw cashew nut sector. It makes local minimum prices more difficult to maintain, and it makes farm gate prices fall as the season goes on. So when we look at this, starting February, March, relatively high price, don't forget this includes high quality origins like Cambodian raw cashew nuts. It also includes origins that would normally tend to make lower prices than Cambodia as the season goes on. And that also is part of the price. But this year we see a familiar pattern. The takeaway, I think, from this is that we're now looking at import values, and this is not market values or offered values. This is actual import values. We're seeing those at pretty much rock bottom levels compared to any time in recent years. So there you have the prices over a much longer period of time. And if we look at the January to July 2023, the average price at 12.30. So this will be a cost and freight price from customs. The red bars are Vietnam. You've got to go right back 2014-15 to see similar price levels. Little dip in 2020, but as I said, that was heavily influenced by the uncertainty around COVID in the early part of the year. Let's have a look at India. Pretty similar situation, really. It's interesting that Indian and Vietnamese prices track each other. Now, why are Vietnamese prices higher than Indian prices in 2021 and 2022? I think that's probably the influence of the Cambodian raw cashew nuts coming on stream. Those products were traded at higher prices in the early part of the season. In general, you would have expected a situation where India is paying higher prices for raw cashew nuts. And that was the case up until recently. But I think that's been influenced by Cambodia. And I'm pretty sure if we took Cambodia out of this calculation, the prices to Vietnam would be a little bit lower than the prices to India. And that's nothing other than the focus on origins. Indian buyers very specific on certain origins, which generally trade at higher prices. Benin, of course, is the good example of that. So a question we must ask when we look at this is, will lower prices cause less planting? This can have an impact on the overall supply-demand situation as we go into the longer term. We know that a lot of cashew trees were planted in this period. We know that in West Africa, yields improved. We know that more trees were planted in Cambodia. And we know that production rose pretty steeply. And it's that today that we're dealing with. So we have to ask the question, will the lower prices that we're now seeing, back to levels 2014, 2015, will they cause fewer trees to be planted and less attention to the existing trees? And this will be especially the case in new producing regions. So newer growers are more likely to change their mind before they've invested too much in the trees or before the trees have grown to full maturity. And it may be that this already has influenced the lower crop production in Cambodia this year. So Cambodia initially forecast to reach 1 million tons of production, which to my mind always seemed unrealistic, at least in the medium term. Is it likely that production will now settle at this level of this year around about the 650,000 tons? So we may already have some evidence that lower prices in recent years have dented the trend in production growth. Only time will tell. So focusing in on the raw cashew nut situation, in Vietnam, as I've been saying, imports strong, up 20%, Vinacas advising processors to ease back, exports of kernels up 13%, very healthy number, and by my calculations, about 2.5 months in stock based on kernels. That would only include product that has cleared customs already, because we can't be certain what might be held in transit as yet unrecorded. In Cambodia, exports to Vietnam lower. It looks like the crop is probably, when everything is calculated, in this range, 625 to 650,000 tons, lower than what might have been expected at the start of the year. In India, imports of raw cashew nuts are down by about 10% compared to 2022. Now, India started with a very high carry-in stock. Let me remind you again that India's imports last year were over 1.3 million tons, and that much of that ended up in stock of raw nuts, but mostly in stock of kernels at this stage. Demand is picking up. It could be that Indian processors will have worked their way through this inventory in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Looking in Côte d'Ivoire, we look at the official export figure I think at the end of July was 720,000 tons. We know that Vietnam has received 409,000 tons of that. We know some of that arrived before the current season, so it was obviously old crop from the end of last year. I think there's about 300,000 tons of float or exported to India. I think somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 tons went to Ghana, about 175, 250 for processing. Bottom line is, if all that were to be correct, and there are plenty of assumptions in there, there's about 150,000 tons left to export. We're looking at the end of July, so whatever's gone out in August should be knocked off that figure too. That would tend to suggest that the stock there is not as high as might have been initially thought. If we look elsewhere around West Africa, Guinea-Bissau, really important at this time of year, 90,000 tons exported, I read recently, which for me means that there's been quite a significant informal trade into Senegal, into the Gambia this year. Prices remain steady. Benin, late season, change in the law, of course, in Benin. A lot of land border trade, I'm told, into Togo, into other countries. Some buying recently from India, prices pretty steady. Ghana, the figures I read, 288,000 tons of exports, probably 60-40 between India and Vietnam. I don't have the latest figure from India, that's why I'm estimating. Not much improvement in processing, more from Foster Boateng on that subject later on. And Nigeria, I think mostly sold out. 168,000 tons in Vietnam, about 100 in India. That looks like the season pretty much over. Probably some balances around. So overall, when we look at this, we can see two things. The balances left in West Africa are not likely to be what they were thought to be earlier in the year. The carryout may be less. I think there will be a carryout, but it may be less. The carryout may actually end up being in the destination countries. We also see the impact of policy and legislation changes. We're seeing more cross-border trade in some countries. So it'll be interesting to see, for example, when we can unpick the figures of the goods shipped through Ghanaian ports, and it'll be interesting to see when we look at what's shipped from Senegal and the Gambia when those trade figures become available. So looking at RCN, the outlook, Vietnam's well bought, but Vietnamese processors appear to be expecting a slowdown in export demand. India buying is likely to pick up, I think, if the Diwali season is going well, if demand is going well, and it seems to be right now. We should also bear in mind that other nuts that compete for those gigantic markets in North India, products like almonds, are in pretty good supply and pretty well priced right now. As I said, I think the closing stocks in West Africa will be lower than we earlier expected. That suggests, though, that early demand for the auction in Tanzania could be slow and it could be low. So people could start or try to start bidding at very low prices to test the resolve in Tanzania. Now, if we see that situation continue through the season, it will be very interesting. Tanzania has new processing development, and this may be something that gives good evidence as to how important that processing development is for that country. So based on our average import prices, processing in Vietnam is still difficult. It's still difficult to make money based on those goods that have been imported. So that's simply taking the RCN that's coming in, comparing it to the market. It would be still difficult today to make money out of it. But based on market prices, well, it's not as bad, but it's not good. Based on the market prices, the cost is still above the lower end of the price range. So we've talked before about the range of prices in kernels. At the moment, it's anywhere from $2.40 for 320s to $2.60, maybe a little more for some in Vietnam. And based on those prices, it's still quite difficult to buy RCN today, sell it tomorrow, and make a margin, which is a way we judge the way the market is behaving. So the RCN outlook, not a great deal of change, but it is beginning to come into perspective. And it does look as if I suppose the biggest single point from this is that the closing stocks in West Africa may be a bit lower than was earlier expected. Let's have a look at kernels, and let's ask this question. If Vietnamese exports are up, and they are up, how are they up if demand is so dead? So what I did was I extracted from the Vietnamese official customs export figures some figures for a range of countries. I started in Europe because Europe was said to be the most difficult market. So I picked 9 countries. Between them, they cover most of the European imports. And I picked a couple of countries that wouldn't be big importers, but would be interesting from a point of view that they have thriving nut sectors. So when we look at those 9 countries, and you can see them on the screen, we did a comparison between last year and this year for the first half of the year. This is January to July. So interestingly, 7 of the 9 countries were up, i.e. their shipments from Vietnam were higher in 2023 than they were in 2022. Only 1 of the 9 countries was significantly down on last year. You can see that's Belgium. I think that's probably a technical reason. So not as depressing a picture on European shipments from Vietnam as we might expect. And I think we should also probably take into account that imports to European countries from West Africa, but also from Africa generally, are again up this year compared to last year. So perhaps the situation is not as bad as maybe it is sometimes portrayed. But this clearly doesn't explain a 13% increase in exports from Vietnam. We have to look further afield to find answers to that. So I looked in the Middle Eastern countries, again, selected a group of countries, some of the major importers, some smaller importers. And when we compare 2022 to 2023, what we see is that 9 of the 10 selected countries showed growth. And what's really interesting is 5 of the countries showed growth in the range of 25 to 29%. Remarkable growth in actual fact. So we are seeing in the Middle East and in Asian countries significant growth in demand. How can that be? How can that be if demand is down, if prices are at 14-year lows? How can that be? So let's have a look and try and see if we can somehow explain this. So we then consolidated our figures and we took North America, which is 2 countries, Canada and the US, mainly for cashews, the 9 European countries, China, 9 Asia, Oceania countries, and the Middle East and North Africa countries, as I've just shown you. And as you can see on the slide, all of these regions show significant growth, except for North America at only 1.3% increase, and Europe. Now we're talking here, to remind you, only about Vietnamese exports. So these figures don't reflect import figures on the other side, because clearly Indian exports are down and African exports are up. So when we look at this, what we're seeing is we're seeing significant improvements in exports in certain countries. Why is that? And to remind you that the basket of countries that have taken cover about 83% of the shipments from Vietnam. And I think the explanation is pretty simple. In countries where prices are quickly passed on to consumers, demand has been, I think booming is a fair description. So where the lower prices have been passed on to consumers, perhaps in China, certainly in Asia, Oceania, and in the Middle East and North Africa, we see significant response from demand as expressed by exports from Vietnam. However, in countries where supermarkets dominate, where price falls have not been passed on, demand growth is slow. That's where I get this idea, summer is a state of mind. So when we look at this, we have to ask, so why would you not pass on lower prices for your raw material? And it's not just cashew nuts, by the way. This applies across a wide range of foodstuffs. So there are some ideas as to why price falls would not be passed on in North America and Europe, regions where supermarkets dominate. I'm not saying there aren't supermarkets in China or in other Asian countries. But what I am saying is that in Europe and North America, supermarkets dominate more than anywhere else in the world. So why would price falls not be passed on? Well, these are some of the explanations. Other costs have risen: labor, energy, packaging, transportation. A whole range of costs have risen. So perhaps supermarkets don't feel in a position to pass those prices on. Secondly, it's a consequence of forward buying that your cost of product for the goods that are delivered today is actually the market that prevailed maybe 6 months, 9 months, even a year ago. And that's one of the disadvantages of forward buying. And it's also clear that in these countries where demand is strong this year, China, Asian countries, Middle East, that forward contracting is less a feature. Cashews tend to be bought much more for prompt, or certainly within 3 months, whereas in North America and Europe, we tend to see situations where the product is bought very far forward. The supermarket's practice of contracting only once or twice a year, that has an impact on that, so that you don't see changes in market prices during the season. The only way you might see it would be that if supermarkets decided to enter into promotions. But there's no promotions of cashews to speak of at the moment, although it may be on the horizon. So taking these factors, economic uncertainty, lack of promotion, forward contracting and forward buying, and other cost prices, we can see reasons why price falls would not be passed on. There is also the aspect in cashews specifically of opportunistic trading, so that we're keeping prices high because we can. And we're seeing that quite a lot, and we're seeing that reported in the news media, certainly here in Europe, quite a lot. Prices kept high simply because it's possible to do so. So when we look at this and we look at how differences in buying patterns impact the market, impact pricing, this is one way in which the war in Ukraine and inflation, especially in Europe and North America, has impacted farmers who live very far away from either problem and who are impacted in the prices they receive for their products. As a note to all of this, it's interesting just to reflect on the idea that the future growth in demand for cashew nuts is most likely to be in these countries. It's most likely to be in China, Asia generally, the Middle East, North Africa, and one hopes in the future in sub-Saharan Africa too. How would that change the whole way the market works if these relatively mature markets settle down to periods of slow growth and we got booming growth in countries where purchasing patterns were very different, business cultures very different, and the ideas that most product is contracted very far forward and sold through supermarkets completely changed? And that would be a huge impact, and will be a huge impact, I think, as we see faster demand growth in those countries than we see in what we might call the traditional markets for cashew kernels. So let's have a look at the demand outlook. I'm saying we are seeing signs of recovery in growth rates in North America and Europe, but only signs at this stage. We're seeing lower prices impacting demand in the Middle East, North Africa, and East Asia. On the longer term, we're seeing that consumer forecasts are continuing to predict long-term growth for cashew kernels in all markets, faster rates in Asia than in Europe or North America, but nonetheless growth, and that this is based on the very basic things, taste, texture, but also on health factors and sustainability. And the relevance of that might become a little bit clearer as we go on in this discussion. But growth recovery is definitely going to be slow in North America and Europe on what we're seeing at the moment. We could see a fear of contract default. So I think this might be particularly relevant in countries where importers have a big part to play. And we might see fear of contract default. So you've bought low, you want to get your shipment, you know that you may not get your shipment if the market moves up strongly. And I think that could become a threat, probably not now, but maybe in the early part of next year. What we're also seeing is that in general, and this to me is part of the unsustainable nature of the cashew supply chain as it's currently formulated, that the interests of the raw cashew nut trade, and by trade I do not mean the people who grow it or the people who process it or the people who consume it, I mean the intermediaries, they still hold a disproportionate power in this chain. So not an easy outlook on demand, not a situation where we can bring an awful lot of good news in terms of demand changes in the short term. But I would say there is some light at the end of the tunnel on what we're seeing. Good demand in India is light. Improving demand in Europe is light. The overall continued sustained increase in Vietnam's exports of kernels this year, that's more light at the end of the tunnel. So moving on to the second part of our discussion today, dealing with the new supply-demand scenario, part two, if you like. Let me remind you first of all about some of the things we spoke about 2 weeks ago. We talked about increasing production. We talked about the impact of Cambodia and how Cambodia's huge increase in production impacted the supply-demand scenario. We talked about the reaction from roasters and supermarkets to the market and to the economic conditions, reducing inventories, buying later, and higher retail prices, as we've just discussed. We talked about the volatility in the market going back 5-6 years ago, what followed, and how that led to the situation where demand growth could not keep up with supply growth in the period post-pandemic. And we talked about this almost vicious circle of how markets were working and how we're getting this circle of how failure to organize and market is impacting the prices, particularly at the farm gate. But we also talked about the good news, and we talked about how the predictions, as I mentioned a few moments ago, for kernels demand looking forward remain very positive. So a difficult situation, but good news. And we looked at those trends, and now we want to ask a question. What do these trends mean for African cashews, and more importantly, for African cashew stakeholders? So let's have a look at some of those. So we look today at lower RCN prices. lower prices have consequences. So we have to ask questions. How do we prevent lower prices from reducing production? Eventually, growers who are not rewarded will either neglect their trees because they don't have the money to manage them, or they will remove their trees and plant something else. Secondly, how do we deal with growers' expectations? If you planted trees in this situation where prices were rising every year, prices were positive, even in the subsequent period when prices were relatively steady, and that were to be followed by much lower prices, how do governments, traders, processors deal with the expectations of growers? Because their expectations or the disappointments might well impact production. And that begs the question, how do we get pricing regulation right? And this is a question for governments, particularly in West Africa, but also in East Africa. How do we make sure that our pricing regulation systems don't negatively impact incomes or production in the longer term? Can yields be improved? So if prices are lower, rather than planting more trees, can yields be improved to protect incomes? And I think, as is widely accepted, one of the easiest ways you can improve incomes on farm for smallholders in the cashew sector is to improve the yields. And there's plenty of precedents and evidence of that over the past 15 years or so. And that means, can better quality protect farm incomes? So if we ask, are buyers prepared to pay more money for better raw cashew nuts? The answer is there. Just look at the price trends for countries that produce high quality nuts. Ghana, Benin, Guinea-Bissau, for example, Cambodia. And it, for me, asks this question: should the policy be focused on more production, that is, or on better quality production, higher yields, fewer trees, less land, better nuts, more nuts? And it's been asked for a long time, but it's not yet been really answered. Increments in improved yields in African countries have been relatively small by comparison with their Asian competitors. Just look at yield figures in West African countries compared to the best in Vietnam, compared to Cambodia, generally speaking, and compared to parts of India. So I think that this new supply-demand scenario asks this about policymakers' decisions in terms of what they focus on. More sounds great. We'll grow 500,000 tons by 2027. It's quite a nice report to read in the newspaper. Much more difficult to explain how actually we're going to grow much better cashews and our farmers are going to benefit from that. And that to me is a big question. So again, we're looking at the second part of what do these trends mean for African stakeholders. Second thing is, and reflecting on our meeting back on the 5th of July, if you were at that, you remember we talked about the impact of Cambodia, the impact on not only quantity, but on timing of the harvest. So this means that raw cashew nut buyers will come later to the market in Africa, simply because they can buy more earlier in Cambodia, and that's what they will do. This means that infrastructure is needed to store and dry, to protect the value of the product that's harvested, especially early in the season. It means that there will be more working capital needed to finance the storage of that raw cashew nuts. And right now, when we look at it and we look at the structure of the trade, the relationship of the cashew industry to financial institutions, and I mean commercial financial institutions in this case, we'd have to ask the question, and maybe even make the statement, that export traders of raw cashew nuts in African countries are better positioned to take advantage or to manage this situation where raw cashew nut buyers will come later to the market than processors currently are. processors, many of them struggle with working capital. If the requirements go up, it's unlikely that they'll be able to cope with that. So is this actually creating a situation which is counter to the development of processing, especially in West Africa, because it shares a similar season to Cambodia, February, March, April onwards? And will this create a situation where actually it becomes more difficult for processors to finance? Asking the question, how do we support processors then? How do we support processors to buy early in the season? So if we get this impact here where we see the overall production going upwards, but the availability being pushed earlier as an impact of Cambodia's 600,000 tons, we need to ask the question, how do we support processors to buy early in the season? And we'd also have to say, in combination with that, because if you get a buildup of inventory, and we've seen it this year, what you see is inventory builds, farm gate prices crash, farm gate prices are far lower than export prices for the raw cashew nuts in terms of their on costs and in terms of that calculation. So not only do we need to support processors, but until such time as everything is processed at origin, which is perhaps the overall demand, somehow we need to incentivize early exports. In other words, to try and move some of the speculation out of the market. Not just that the strong get stronger, but that the entire sector benefits, and that would protect farm gate prices. So the second question is, how do we manage the fact that raw cashew nut buyers will come later to the market? And that's a significant trend. Third major factor, going back to our discussion back in February, on the 1st of February, in fact, we talked about more value addition from Vietnam in 2020. And we do see this. We see Vietnamese processors gearing up for higher value addition, roasted products, packed products, consumer packed products, exporting to Europe and the United States, but also Australia, China, and other markets. And that's a trend, and it's a trend now. If you look at US figures, as we did 2 weeks ago, US figures for imported processed cashews way up on recent years. So looking at this, how is the African cashew sector geared to compete with roasted and processed cashews from Vietnam? How will African processors manage the development of a next generation of processing equipment from Vietnam? And that's going to happen because that is a logical outcome of looking for value-added markets. It's a logical outcome of hard times. Yes, you'll get a rationalization, but also you get an improvement in the process and even lower costs. So it's quite likely that this situation continues at least until demand recovers to strong growth. Let's have a look at some of the other trends just to remind ourselves of what's driving consumer demand. And first of all, we think about, so these are the basic things. These are the things that cause cashews to increase their demand and have done for the past 10 years or so. The basic thing is quality, taste, texture. Are we making a good enough product? And I walked around a number of stores recently and looked at the quality of the product, and it's poor. You've got to say that the quality of cashew nuts that we're seeing on the shelves in European supermarkets is poor compared to what it was 15, 20 years ago, in my experience. Other factors, health, sustainability, innovation. These are driving demand. If you don't believe that, do some research, go online, look at, not necessarily cashews, look at articles about consumer demand for food right around the world. And this is not just a European thing, it's not just an American thing. Absolutely every country is concerned with the health of the food they're eating and the sustainability of it. Part of that is traceability. part of that is responsibility, corporate responsibility in this case. So these are the drivers of demand growth. Are we well positioned to compete in that environment as an African cashew sector? Are we managing our supply chain? Are we managing the sector and the processes well? And most of all, in my opinion, are we marketing? So when we look at the trends, we're seeing a number of trends related to the change in the supply-demand balance. But we also have to take into account the basic driving trends behind the development of the cashew sector, not just now, not just last year, but over the past 20 years. And these are all factors. So we need to ask ourselves, how can these trends be turned in favor of African cashews? So a few factors. Firstly, let's look at consumer trends and let's think about those things like sustainability, like traceability, taste, quality. Consumer trends are certainly aligned with African cashews, with traceable origin processed cashew kernels. I've no doubt about that. Secondly, the natural smallholder production methods are aligned with consumer trends. Yes, it's a huge job to manage a smallholder supply chain, but it can be turned to advantage. It can become a significant advantage. Now, everyone buys cashews grown by smallholders. Consumers mostly don't know that, nor do they know that the cashews are largely not processed close to where those smallholders grow them. Third factor, and this goes back to the question, do we market? Would African cashew sectors, countries, processors, farmers be stronger together if there was a generic African cashew marketing project? We know that a global generic marketing project is not on, because India mainly sells Indian cashew kernels, Indian processed cashew kernels to the Indian market. Vietnam will start its own generic marketing, and it's likely more and more to be focused on value-added products. So do we need a stronger together generic African cashew marketing approach? I think we do. We have to take into account the trends in the market. So later buying, lower raw RCN prices, make processors more needed at the origin. The current situation, the current supply-demand imbalance, which has been turned on its head in the last 5 years, means that processing at origin is more needed than ever. How to support processors in doing that? Managing the surplus needs infrastructure. If buyers are going to come to the market later, infrastructure is needed to protect the quality of the product. So when we look at these two factors, there's no easy answer to these. There's no grand scheme. There's no industrial park that will settle the problem. It takes a long time to make a factory work, and it takes good management. If there's a shortage of managers, if the time taken isn't appreciated, the ventures are likely to run into problems. And when it comes to policy, it means that proactive policy, rather than reactive policy, should be aligned with realistic market-based objectives. So ideas that we will process 100% by next October, ideas that all of our cashew kernels will be sold in particular markets. It's fantastic in terms of ambition, but the policy that supports them needs to be aligned with realistic market-based objectives. And the market-based bit is the most important part. You can have whatever ambition you like, but if it's not viable in the market, it's meaningless. So let's have a look in summary then at how some of these trends could be turned in Africa's favor. We have quality product, resilient, diversified, short supply chain. This is a buyer requirement. This is something they would like, a short supply chain. They need food safety, no compromise on food safety. They need traceability and transparency. They cannot get that right now. A large proportion of the world's cashew kernels lose their identity in the current system. They need price stability. You don't need me to say that price stability is not common in the cashew sector. And buyers need labor and environment compliance. So this is not just a corporate ambition of major buyers in developed countries. These consumers are talking about these factors. This is also how cashews are sold. Not only on quality and taste as it once was, but also on these factors. Diversified supply chains, traceability, transparency, labor and environmental compliance. And if you look at the 3 boxes highlighted in green, those 3 things are absolutely only available right now on origin processed cashews, and that means African cashews. That means about 60% of world's production. We could do that, but we don't do it because we don't have infrastructure and we don't have processing. So the trends are running in favor of the development of the African cashew sector. How do we make that happen? This is about promotion of cashews, promotion of African cashews. Now, I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, and someone asked me for some examples of something I'd mentioned, which was about Californian almonds. So I thought let's have a little look and see exactly what Californian almond industries did to turn around a similar situation in their sector. So when the Californian almond producers were faced with this chart, this dynamic, incredible increase in production over a long period of time. But really, this trajectory, and doesn't it look quite similar to the cashew trajectory? Going back about 15 years ago, this chart ends in 2018, an enormous increase in production. These are slides drawn from a presentation by the Almond Board of California back in 2019, and their words were to describe it as an amazing trajectory of production, moving sharply upwards. What did they do? They set out marketing objectives to build long-term worldwide demand for Californian almonds, to create an environment where perceptions and brands thrive, and to address the issues and opportunities in the sector, and to contribute to the financial well-being of the industry. All of that sounds very familiar to me as an answer to some of the problems that we face in the cashew sector right now. Let's keep going on Californian almond marketing. This is what they achieved. So before the first decade of this century, almonds suffered from this misconception. Unhealthy, high cholesterol, bad for you, snacks, etc. Doesn't that sound familiar too? But they changed that. And they changed the profile from heart healthy, lifestyle nut. And they changed the consumer perceptions of Californian almonds in all of these major countries. All of those arrows are improved consumer perceptions. So you can imagine today, pretty much no consumer knows where their cashews come from. Pretty much no consumer has an idea that there is a long supply chain moving cashew nuts right around the world, in fact, often in the wrong direction. Imagine if we changed that in 5 to 10 years, that almonds became a similar story to cashews, that cashews were identified as sustainable, as positive, as heart healthy, as the lifestyle nut. And it meant that prices at the farm gate actually increased. So we've seen production went sky high, but prices also increased. Now, there, as you can see on the chart, there is volatility in price, but look at the trend line. Overall prices have trended upwards for almonds. So that almonds end up with a leadership role in food and in agriculture in California, something that never would have been dreamt of 30 years ago. And you can see on those slides just what it means to change perception. How did they do it? They put in place a marketing strategy. They identified the key elements of that strategy, redefining the product. Now, you may say, it's not possible for us to do this. And probably you'd be right. But it is certainly possible to do elements of this. Redefining the importance in health of cashews is a big task. Redefining the importance of the African cashew sector in the buyer's perceptions is an achievable task. And it means understanding. So in the case of almonds, they talked about changing their own understanding of their market, of almonds, of nutrition. And then shifting, in their case, shifting from ingredients to snacking. In the case of cashews, it's the other way around, changing from snacking to ingredients so that there'll be much broader, widespread applications, greater diversity in the product. Not to say that snacking should be neglected, it shouldn't, it's a huge area of growth. But the point is that there are strategies and there are ways to change buyers' perceptions of the product, and particularly of the product from Africa, simply because African cashews, the African cashew sector, is very well aligned with what consumers and buyers want to hear anyway. Quality, short supply chain, traceability, transparency, responsibility. The African cashew sector already has many of these things, but not many consumers, perhaps not even many roasters, realize that. Of course, you'll ask, who's going to pay for this? Of course, you're right to ask who's going to pay for it. Well, in the case of almonds, it was paid for by industry assessments, as they call them. There's a marketing board in California set up way back in the 1950s, and they levied 3 cents per pound on all shipments to pay for marketing. That included domestic and international. And in response to certain market situations, they increased it. They increased it to 4 cents per pound back in 2016 temporarily. Now, to put that in perspective, 3 cents per pound is 1.1% of the current W320 price. I'm not saying it would be easy, but it is something that worked in California. California provides a template. California almonds provide a template and a vision for what can be achieved. And we should really ask ourselves, could something like this work for African cashews? It would mean working together across countries. It would mean seeking to understand the market, and it would mean working out a method to pay for generic production. And we really need to ask ourselves these days that at a time when the world is in a massive surplus of cashews, and that surplus isn't going to go away over the next 8 to 10 years, is it really the right thing to do to support growth of more and more cashews? Would it not be better? Would it not be more productive to seek to A, improve the quality and the activity of what we're doing right now, and B, to work on marketing and improving the profile of African cashews with consumers and roasters around the world. So in summary, key factors to deal with the new supply-demand balance from the point of view of the African cashew sector. Understand the market, understand the unique selling proposition that is African cashew kernels. Understand the factors of traceability, the factors of short supply chain quality responsibility that I've mentioned. Understand the story itself. What is the marketing story? Do we even understand that ourselves? Focus on the performance and competitiveness of the sector. Are our processors competitive? How can we fix that? Is it about management? Is it about machines? It's often about management, in my experience. Policy should be aligned with the market reality. So policymakers need to consider not only what's going on their own doorstep, not only the impact short term within their own country, but the impact in the longer term and the opportunity in the longer term based on the current market reality. The cashew world is waiting for Africa to step up. And to do that, the first focus needs to be on marketing. And that is, for me, the primary fact in dealing with the current supply-demand imbalance is to focus on better marketing. And the best example I can find is the marketing of Californian almonds over the past 25 years or so, which is well worth having a look at if you're interested in developing ideas on this subject. Well, let's move on. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to now introduce Foster Boateng from the Tree Crops Development Authority of Ghana. I've had the pleasure to work with Foster a little, and he is developing some very interesting changes to the Ghanaian sector. Foster, how are you?
I'm doing great, James.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So,
that was a spectacular presentation. That was great.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did. I listened to every bit of it.
Very good of you. Thank you. What would you like to tell us about the Ghanaian situation?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. As you are aware, cashew is a very important commodity for Ghana. And currently, the government of Ghana has established an authority with a regulator. We are not just regulating, we are also helping develop the cashew sector, including other 5 tree crop commodities. But for the purpose of today's discussion, let me limit myself to cashew. If you look at what we are doing in Ghana at the moment, Ghana government, through Ministry of Food and Agriculture, developed what we call the tree crop policy. And the policy has highlighted on a number of challenges confronting the tree crop sector, including cashew. One of them is low productivity, which we are all aware. Though production levels have increased, but it's just about increasing land area. We've also seen challenges in terms of processing. Currently, only a little bit above 10% of the RCN is being processed in Ghana. Most of them are exported in raw form. Production levels, though, we have improved a little bit, and we are around close to about 200,000 plus metric tons. We have also more or less improved on the quality a little bit. We can see improvement from about 46 to now 52. 52 when we are in the early stages of trade. When the trade starts early, you'll see that the quality is up, is a little bit better than when you are getting to somewhere March, April, thereabout, then the quality falls. But let me see some few things that we have been able to do as authority. We have been mandated to regulate the sector and then also develop the sector. So we have three key areas we are looking at. First of all, we are concerned about the economic growth within the sector. How can we create wealth for distribution and create the jobs that we want? And so TCDA has developed a strategy, thinking that in the next 5 years, how can we improve the enabling environment to attract private sector investments? And then also, how can we invest in research and development in a way to improve quality and also address some of the challenges confronting the sector? And the final one is, how do we really strengthen the private sector? Create an environment where the private sector will be able to thrive and create the jobs and the foreign exchange that we are looking forward to. So a couple of things have come to mind. First, before developing this sector, we have the environment and the social issues and the governance as one of our key focus. First of all, how do we really produce sustainably in terms of environmentally, socially, and also looking at the governance structures of the value chain actors or value chain associations, both the downstream and the upstream. As part of it, TCDA has developed a regulation, and currently, as I speak, the regulation is in Parliament, and it will soon be passed. I think we are expecting Parliament to be back by maybe October, and it will finally be passed. In the regulation, what we are trying to look at is, how do we really strengthen the quality, address issues of quality, address issues of farm gate pricing, and then also address issues in terms of environmental concerns that goes with the production of these commodities. So currently, we are also trying to, as much as possible as a country, to see how we can push processing. And pushing processing, we have had interaction with the Cashew Council and their members to discuss how we can best support processing. And in view of that, the government have been able to attract a facility from the World Bank. And we are going to look at three things. First, we are going to improve productivity, not putting more land under cultivation, but if we can cause expansion in production vertically. And then also how we can get research to drive that. Another level of support that we wanted to put into the sector is also how we are going to support processes. So the facility is going to look at things to do with providing technical assistance support to processors in terms of how they manage their businesses, and then also providing matching grants to attract commercial loans in terms of CAPEX for them to retool their processing equipment. And then another way is also trying to look at how we can provide support for them to keep inventory for raw cashew nut for processing. These are few challenges that we are trying to address. We know it's not adequate, but as we move on, we'll be able to address some of these things, and some of the recommendations you provided in your presentation looks quite encouraging and attractive, which we'll look into that. Finally, we are also trying to build capacity of FBOs or the farmers in a way to strengthen their capacity for to have a strong bargaining power in a case where they can respect forward contracts as much as possible. One thing that we also try as an authority is to look at the farm gate pricing to create incentives for farmers. We have done it for 2 seasons. We have learned some lessons. The road has been rough, but lessons have been learned. When normally we set the prices at the early part of trading, it seems to be going very well, because last year, for instance, I think this year, for instance, we set the price at 8.5 cedis per kilo. And market forces managed to push it to 13 cedis. That was wonderful, and that was great for our farmers. But as soon as Côte d'Ivoire opened its floodgates, and as soon as quality begin to drop, because moisture levels are picking up around maybe February, March, April, quality dropped. And so far, prices slammed to as low as 4 cedis, and the farmers were not happy. Again, TCD had to intervene and engage them, because we are using a pricing formula which is an algorithm and has some factors that really inform the design of the formula. So when some of the parameters change, certainly the prices should change. But I think what we haven't done well is to sensitize the farmers to understand how the algorithm works and the fact that changes will come as and when some of the factors do change, especially global market prices are one of such factors in the algorithm. And then also exchange rate as well. So quickly we stepped in because we know that policy is not time invariant. So from time to time, you have to engage the stakeholders to understand that you set one policy, and as time goes on, when the factors change, things must change, and you need to change to make sure that both parties are happy. So these are some of the lessons we have learned. But I think going forward, the pricing mechanism has worked very well, but we will engage more. I think that's what is really lacking. We need to engage the farmers from time to time so that they don't say that once you set a price, that is going to stay throughout the year. So they need to understand that at some time, at some level, the factors will change. And Ghana is not the only player in the market. Cote d'Ivoire is the market lead. And so once production show up in Cote d'Ivoire, certainly may affect prices. So I think in a nutshell, what we want to do, as I said, was again, strengthen the environmental and social safeguards in the sector, and then also address issues about governance, institutional governance for the value chain actors, particularly the Cashew Council, the producers, and then also the processors. Let me pause here for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Foster. It's really interesting what you're saying, and I think that your progress to date and the kind of factors that are being considered is interesting. But I'm going to ask a question that someone on the chat has asked. What's delaying the legislation coming in? When are we likely to see the legislation fully in place?
Okay. All right. Can I go ahead?
Please do.
Okay, good. Yeah, when you are setting up a regulation, it goes through processes. And we've really gone through a very long road, a lengthy road. And as such, I think early this year, we have to do a pre-laying with Parliament. Parliament has gone through. Now everything has passed. Now it is with Parliament to really pass it at their session. Normally when you file it, it takes about 21 days. We're not so lucky. They went on recess about a couple of weeks ago. We hopefully we'll get it done by October.
Okay, so it's imminent.
Yeah.
And do you see Ghana, we know that Ghana has particular conditions. You have a very interesting transit trade from surrounding countries, pretty good port infrastructure. What we haven't seen in recent years is the rise in processing in Ghana in line with production and the transit trade. What kind of a timeline and what kind of supports for new processors or for older processors to get back on the road again, so to speak? What do you envisage coming forward? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just give us a general idea.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I think in my submission, I said that we have secured a facility. We are rolling out a 6-year program, DAB, tree crop diversification, in a way to revamp some of the old processes. We'll start from the known to the unknown. We'll look at the old ones, how they are struggling, and how we'll be able to bring them up. I think some of them have to do with policy issues that we need to look at it and do a policy refresh. Though if you look at the policy document for the tree crop sector, they did it in 2012, and it's been a long time. So as part of this intervention, we are engaging the processors to look at where the challenges are and what we can do in terms of refreshing the policy to support them. We are aware that a number of processors are moving to Cote d'Ivoire. We need to know what is happening in Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, so that it can also help us to entice our processors to stay in Ghana. So as part of the program, I think what we are trying to do is, first of all, The old ones need new equipment, new retooling. We have to retool the equipment, and we need to support them in their processing. And as part of the facility of 100 million, about 35% is going into that. I think between 25-30%, I'm sure, is going to support the processes in terms of their capex, in terms of technical support in their manufacturing processes. These are the areas where we are going to focus in the next 6 years. We believe that within 6 years, even if we cannot get all the old processes revamped, we can at least get about 2 or 3 who are on their feet to really process and increase RCN processing in Ghana.
Super. A few more success stories would do wonders for the long-term development of the sector.
Sorry, didn't get that.
I was saying a few more success stories in processing would do wonders for the long-term outlook for the sector.
Sure. I think you also raise a point about price volatility at the farm gate and how we can incentivize farmers. I think not only just setting price, giving price formulas to agree on minimum pricing, but we also have to help the farmers to diversify in the work they do. So that is why, as part of this project, we are going to work the farmers to diversify their production and their investments so that they can also gain additional income from other sources, not only the cashew. In some cases, we are going to look at agroforestry issues where we can do some intercropping. And then we are liaising with Rabobank under their ACON program to see if we can get farmers to start registering for carbon credits. That can also bring additional income to the farmers to support their farming activities. Second, we are also looking at how you reduce their cost of production. When cost of production is reduced, you are likely also to be competitive and be profitable. So these are areas where we are trying to look at. And the last one you mentioned about policies must be market focused and market oriented. Currently, we are trying to also establish what we called market-driven research agenda, where we bring market players and researchers on a platform for researchers be informed by what the market wants to enable them develop cultivars that command that kind of traits that the market is looking for. So these are all measures being taken as part of TCDA strategy to really revamp the cashew sector.
Wow, I like what I'm hearing.
Sorry?
I like what I'm hearing. But it's a demanding agenda.
Yeah.
Thanks, Foster. Stay with us. I'm going to pass back to Blessing. Blessing, are there any questions in the chat?
Thank you very much. Yes, we do have some questions addressed to you and also to Foster. So, but we'll probably begin with the questions addressed to you. The first question is, why is exports to Vietnam from Cambodia declining?
It's declined because production declined. I mean, if you look at the overall long-term trend, it's strong, but in the last couple of years, production has been down a little bit, and therefore exports have declined. It's not to say that there's anything left unsold in Cambodia. Cambodian raw nuts sell out and will sell out every year. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question is, are there impacts of the instability in the Sahel region to the cashew industry in Africa and beyond? And if not, should we be anticipating?
Yeah, there are undoubtedly impacts of instability. We've seen instability in certain cashew producing countries. But let's say from the point of view of an investor, it's going to be very difficult to attract investment in processing to countries where there is instability or the prospect of instability. We've seen that in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, an operating, efficient, stable country attracts a great deal of investment in cashews. And that will only happen if there is stability in the economy and politically in all of the countries. So I think that we probably are not likely to see any great uptick in this in the short term because I think these factors are already in the minds of potential investors. On the other hand, I don't think that it's likely to impact the consumer's view of the cashews from those countries or from West Africa in general, but it might cause buyers to be more careful or more cautious in the countries that they source from in the future. So yeah, it has impacts and we need to be aware of those. And also I think another thing that we need to be aware of is that many buyers don't really understand the geography. So we need to make people aware of location, aware of stability and conditions in the countries that they're being offered cashews from. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question is, how are Vietnamese exports up if processing in the country is so difficult?
Well, that's a great question. And I wish I knew a full answer to that question. If we look at Vietnam, we see a huge industry. We see a lot of forward sales. And to a large extent, the industry is based on forward sales. So not all companies are at a position where they can no longer continue. But if you're a large developed business, developed over many years, you're not going to just close down because you're having a difficult year. You're going to continue. So making money out of processing, or at least making the kind of margins that were expected in the past, has become difficult. But businesses are continuing. Normally in these situations, what we see is a rationalization in the sector, and that takes time. So processors will continue to process and they will continue to supply the demand until such time as they are completely unable to do so. And they will be hoping that the alignment between raw cashew nut prices and kernels comes back in line so that margins return to where they were. And that's critical, obviously, or otherwise the industry will run into significant difficulty in the future. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. There is a need for clarification here. The attendee says, IVC quality declined and kernel price not improved. Then why Vietnamese imports high? Why would Vietnamese import high quantity compared with last year?
Well, we don't know if Vietnam is going to import more this year or not. What we know is that up to the end of July, Vietnam has imported more from Côte d'Ivoire. Well, I wasn't saying that the quality has declined. I'd like to clarify that. What I'm saying is that the quality tends to decline in the course of the season in most countries. And the reason for that is an absence of infrastructure to protect the quality and working capital to buy it and assemble it. So that product left on farms by the time we get into June and July in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, tends to be of lower quality. So I'm not saying that the quality from the country overall has declined. What I am saying is that from the start of the season to the end of the season, there tends to be a decline in the quality, and that impacts the price. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have two more questions for you before we move to the questions addressed to Mr. Foster. So the first one says, is it true that cashew taste in the Sahel countries is different from that of non-Sahelian ones?
It is true that the taste of cashews varies from country to country, even across the Sahel. Taste is obviously an objective factor for some when we come to buying, but for many people, taste is very subjective, and a cashew that's perfect for one person may not be as attractive to someone else. I remember taking a sample of cashews from Benin, a sample of cashews from Côte d'Ivoire, and a sample of cashews from Tanzania to a group of customers, and they could definitely taste different tastes. Some preferred Benin taste, but over the group, some preferred Tanzania, some preferred Cote d'Ivoire. So taste is subjective, of course. Taste does vary from country to country. The Sahel countries, I don't think we could say in general that the taste is different, but we can say that there are differences. And identifying that's really important part of marketing, is to identify if there is an advantage in taste. It's a really great question, and it's something that would be worth doing some more research into, perhaps with consumer panels, for example. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I will now move over to Mr. Foster for the questions addressed to him. Hello, Mr. Foster, are you still with us?
Blessing, I'm here.
Thank you very much. I believe Jim has already asked the first question. So the second one says, what is the authority doing to ensure prices do not continually fluctuate and are respected, as this will affect local processors' ability to purchase? What steps are being taken now in preparation for the next season?
Okay. Thank you. That was a great question. For me, we've learned from our lessons, as I said, in looking at minimum farm gate prices. But what we are trying to do is, first of all, we are engaging our farmers to keep the quality, because it's not just the price, but it is tagged to some quality parameters that come with the pricing mechanism. And I think our farmers are not adhering to that. So that is a support that we need to give them. We need to support in the area of drying. We need to also sensitize them about what the market wants. I think that's an area where TCDA, together with Ministry of Food and Agriculture and the various stakeholders, have a lot of work to do as the season is about to start. So that's what we'll do. As for price fluctuation, you see, it's a market phenomenon. And usually, as I said, our pricing mechanism has factors that depends on other factors like global market, quality. And so if those factors are affected, certainly the prices will be affected. So I can assure you that the prices will stay stable, but at least we'll do whatever we can to ensure that farmers get a deserved price for the work that they have done. Let me also come back to, I think there was something to do with what we are doing. This year, we are only not looking at, when the regulation comes to force, we ensure that we will not allow those who have not registered, be licensed to go to the farm gate and to be buying cashew from farmers. And if you look into the regulation, it's an area reserved for Ghanaians and for local people and for our local Ghanaians. So every foreigner who wants to go to the farm gate to buy needs to have a local aggregator or a trader who do that for him. So we hope that these regulations will come by October and then we can enforce that. Two, we are also working with GCS, Ghana Commodity Exchange, to see how some of we can create a market avenue for those who want to sell their RCN. I think last year they managed to do almost about 10,000 metric tons on stock exchange. We're hoping on commodity exchange, sorry. We are hoping that we'll be able to increase the volumes as time goes on, so that it gives the farmers option where to sell their commodity. That's what I'll say for now, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foster. The next question is, has this 6-year program started?
Good. I would say yes. Yes, in the sense that we have just gotten approval from the bank board to finance the project. Now, the project units are in the process of putting all the paperwork together. We have 2 more steps to go. The first step is to really get Parliament to ratify the facility. And we are looking somewhere around October, because since they are on recess. And if they come back in October and it's ratified, then the next step is there are other conditions that we need to fulfill. For instance, we need to get the project implementation manual in place, which the project team is working assiduously to achieve that target. So hopefully the full implementation will take off in November.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foster. Does that go to answer another question related to the cashew processes in Ghana. How soon should they expect their support from the authority?
Well, that's interesting. Well, we under this project, I said any time after November, because I can't be definite unless because the first disbursement we expected it in November. So let's say that maybe early part of next year, because we will advertise it in the dailies. We will pre-qualify these processes. There are a set of criteria they need to go through to qualify to get the support. So I think all those things are being worked out. The modalities are being worked out. So at the moment, I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but tentatively, I will say that they should look out for early next year.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foster. That will be all. Jim, over to you.
Thanks, Blessing. Well, I guess that winds up our session for today. My thanks to Foster Boateng on the Tree Crops Development Authority of Ghana. As always, Foster gave us plenty of food for thought and a pretty good explanation of where TCDA stands on the road to development of the sector. Seems to me that from 2024 we can expect pretty big things in Ghana. In terms of outlook, I don't think we're going to see the market spring into life in the immediate future. The next 2 weeks might be relatively quiet, but look out for some activity early in September after buyers get back. And as I said, this idea that summer is a state of mind disappears. We might see some more forward buying. I would again thank Foster and also to thank all of our participants for joining us today, and also thanks to those who asked some questions, some really interesting questions in there, and they've given me some ideas for what we might talk about in the coming events. So thanks very much. I look forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks, and especially look forward to seeing you at the African Cashew Alliance conference in Senegal. Thanks, Foster. Thanks, everyone. All the best for now.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another session. And of course, to our guest, Mr. Foster from TCDA for joining us today. We also want to appreciate our participants who joined us today, and of course to our sponsors and partners who have continually made it possible for us to bring these sessions to you. As Jim rightly mentioned, the 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference will be taking place from the 8th of September at the Palm Beach Resorts and Spa in Saly, Senegal. And we have 8 days more for the early bird rate. We ask that you register right now and get those early birds. But the conference will take place in 26 days. We hope that you will join us at the 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference. And until we see you again for the next Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick, do stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Recording stopped.